The morning Marcus Chen first decided to move his alpaca herd to Willow Creek was the morning his therapist had suggested he find peace, real peace, not the Instagram kind. He was 42, burned out from 15 years in venture capital, and the alpacas had started as a joke, a weekend diversion on a borrowed ranch in Malibu. But they'd become something else, an anchor, a reason to wake up that didn't involve spreadsheets or the crushing weight of other people's expectations. He'd found the property online at 2 a.m., still riding the manic energy of his resignation letter. 5 acres in Willow Creek, Oregon, a town so small it didn't have a Starbucks. 2 miles from the main road. Perfect. It was the kind of place where people left you alone, or so he'd thought. The fence had been his first project. A proper one, not the flimsy suburban kind, but a genuine boundary. 6 feet tall, sturdy wooden beams with reinforced wire at the base to prevent predators from burrowing underneath. He'd hired Rodriguez's crew, the best fencing contractors in the county. They'd finished on a Thursday. By Friday, the alpacas, Lancelot, Esmeralda, Duchess, and Boomer, had tested every inch of it and apparently approved. By the following Tuesday, Marcus had received his first letter from Karen Montgomery. He almost threw it away. The envelope had urgent community concern written on the front in aggressive all-caps font, and he could smell the entitlement through the paper. But something, maybe the therapist's voice in his head, maybe just curiosity, made him open it. The letter was a masterclass in weaponized politeness. Karen had used bullet points. She'd even cited local ordinances that Marcus was pretty sure didn't exist. The core complaint was simple. The fence was aggressively blocking the natural sightlines of the neighborhood and created an unfortunate precedent of deliberate isolation that suggested Marcus had something to hide. He'd laughed until his stomach hurt. But Karen Montgomery wasn't a woman built to accept laughter as a response. Over the next 3 weeks, she escalated. She created a Facebook group, Willow Creek Beautiful, preserving our community aesthetic. It had 47 members, which felt like a lot for a town of 200. She'd printed photographs showing the fence from various angles, trying to prove it looked like a fortress. She'd filed a complaint with the county planning office. Nothing came of it. She'd organized a petition, which Marcus discovered when his neighbor, Patricia Wung, mentioned it with obvious embarrassment while dropping off a casserole. Patricia was nice. Marcus liked Patricia. She'd apologized for Karen multiple times, and she wasn't the type to do things she didn't mean. That's when Marcus knew it was serious. She's just passionate about the community, Patricia had offered, which was Patricia's way of saying her neighbor was unhinged. She doesn't mean anything personal. She's always like this about something. What was it last year? Marcus had asked. Patricia had winced. The Hendersons' mailbox. She said it was the wrong style for the neighborhood. Marcus had let that sit in his brain for exactly the time it took to understand that Karen Montgomery operated in a specific register of crazy that couldn't be reasoned with, bought off, or appeased. The fence wasn't about the fence. It was about control. The fence represented something Karen couldn't control, and that was intolerable to her. He'd made a decision then. He was going to build a relationship with his alpacas and ignore Karen Montgomery with the focus of a monk. It had lasted 4 weeks. The knock came on a Tuesday morning in March. Marcus was out with the alpacas, running his hands over Lancelot's neck. The big guy had been a little skittish since the fence was finished, as if the boundary between himself and the world had made him newly aware of the world's existence when he heard it. Not a knock, exactly. A pounding. Someone trying to make their knuckles weaponize sound. He turned to see a blonde woman in her mid-50s, wearing Lululemon leggings and an expression of profound moral conviction, marching toward his house like she was leading a civil rights movement. Karen Montgomery was smaller than he'd expected. 5'4", probably, and constructed in that particular way of women who'd spent the last 2 decades fighting gravity and winning through pure force of will and dermabrasion. She had the kind of thin lips that seemed designed specifically for pressing together into disapproving lines, and her eyes had that familiar glint of someone who'd confused their own anxiety with righteousness. "Mr. Chen?" She didn't wait for confirmation. "I'm Karen Montgomery. I've tried to reach you through official channels, and since you've chosen to ignore the community's very reasonable requests, I'm here to speak with you directly." Marcus set down his hand. Duchess had been about to nip his fingers, which was her particular brand of flirtation, and smiled. "Good morning. I'm sorry, have we met? I sent you a letter, professional, thorough, documenting the issues with your fence." "I got it," Marcus said. I didn't respond because I don't believe there are any issues. The fence meets all code requirements and it's on my property. Corinne's jaw tightened. This was clearly not the response she'd prepared for. In her world, reasonable people capitulated when presented with official-sounding language. Your fence is an eyesore, she said flatly. It's been brought to the attention of multiple residents, and it sets a tone for this community that we don't want. We're talking about cohesion, unified aesthetics. This is what separates a neighborhood from a commune. Marcus felt the first warm flicker of actual anger, which he tried to extinguish immediately. Fighting with Corinne was exactly what would keep him from peace. The alpacas appreciate the privacy, he said instead. They're prey animals. The fence keeps them safe and calm. It's actually for their well-being. Your animals? Corinne's voice shifted into something sharper. Yes, about those. I've documented at least 12 instances of them approaching the fence line when residents pass by. That's intimidating behavior. That's territorial aggression. I'm not sure those creatures are safe to have on residential property. They're guard animals, Marcus said. That's literally their function. They're supposed to be alert. They're not aggressive unless provoked. They stare, with an intensity that frankly borders on menacing. Marcus found himself staring at Corinne with an intensity that probably also bordered on menacing. So he excused himself and went inside, leaving her standing in the yard with Lancelot, who had absolutely no respect for human social hierarchies, and was now following her around with the focused interest of someone genuinely considering whether her braided hair might be edible. He'd watched through the kitchen window as Corinne practically fled back to her car, swatting at the alpaca's lowered head, and Marcus had felt the first real flush of dark joy. The alpacas had her number. That should have been the end of it. That should have been Corinne learning a valuable lesson about the fact that the world didn't revolve around her Pinterest board aesthetic. But Corinne Montgomery wasn't built for lessons. Instead, the complaints escalated. She filed new paperwork with the county, this time claiming the alpacas themselves violated some subsection of an ordinance about unusual livestock in residential zones. They didn't. Marcus had checked. She started showing up with a camcorder, filming the alpacas from the road as if she was documenting crimes against humanity. She created a GoFundMe to hire a lawyer to challenge the fence's legality, though Marcus couldn't imagine what ground she thought she was standing on. The GoFundMe raised $340, all of it from one person, her mother. By June, Marcus realized that Corinne Montgomery was the first person to successfully pierce his carefully constructed bubble of I don't care anymore. She was under his skin like a splinter, and the more he tried to ignore her, the more she seemed to multiply, appearing at different times with different complaints, each one more creative and desperate than the last. He'd started checking his phone obsessively. He'd started timing his alpaca walks to avoid seeing her car pass on the road. He'd started having conversations in his head where he told her off, which meant, quite clearly, that she'd already won the fundamental battle. She was occupying his consciousness. His therapist would have sighed. It was Patricia who first warned him that Corinne was talking about the fence itself. She's saying it was put up as a deliberate statement, Patricia reported one afternoon, bringing another casserole, this one with a note apologizing for Corinne's existence. She's saying you're hiding something. She's saying the speed at which you built it was suspicious. I don't know. I think she's decided you're some kind of crime lord using the alpacas as a front. That's genuinely unhinged, Marcus said, but his stomach had tightened. Yes, Patricia agreed. It is, but she's very committed to being unhinged. I wanted to warn you, I think she's planning something. That something arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, 3 months after he'd first moved to Willow Creek. Marcus was inside making coffee when he heard the sound, not the soft ring of the fence wires in wind, but the sharp, decisive snap of them giving way. He dropped his mug. It shattered across the kitchen tile in a way that felt prophetic. When he ran outside, he saw immediately what had happened. Someone, and Marcus didn't need 3 guesses about who, had used bolt cutters to create a 6-foot gap in the fence. A clean-cut professional work. They'd also left a note stapled to the fence post. Your fence divides this community. I'm removing it section by section if necessary until you learn how to be a neighbor. I have the legal right to do this, and I have witnesses. Maybe next time you'll listen to reason. K. Montgomery. The note was unsigned at the bottom, but signed by her own hand at the top in a way that made it clear she genuinely believed she was in the right. Marcus stood there for a long moment, the coffee mug still dripping from his hands, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. It was the moment when his carefully cultivated peace, the whole reason he'd come to Willow Creek, the whole reason he'd left the venture capital world behind, shattered as definitively as that mug. Because here was the thing about people like Corinne Montgomery. They didn't respect boundaries because they didn't respect other people as sovereign beings. They only understood force. Marcus looked at the gap in the fence, at the exposed vulnerability of his property, his animals, his sanctuary. Then he looked at the alpacas, who were already aware that something was wrong, their ears pricked, their collective attention locked on that breached section of the perimeter. Lancelot, in particular, was very, very still. "I know, buddy," Marcus said quietly. "I know." And then Marcus went inside and made a call to his fencing contractor. But he wasn't going to repair the fence the same way. Part 2, the new boundary. Rodriguez arrived the next morning with his crew, and Marcus laid out his vision with a clarity that surprised even himself. He'd spent most of the previous night researching, making calls, and consulting with veterinarians who specialized in guard alpacas. The fence would be reinforced, yes, stronger, higher, with better materials. But more importantly, the perimeter would be optimized for what Marcus's alpacas already were. Apex predators by proxy, animals that had been bred and selected for thousands of years to protect livestock against far more dangerous threats than confused suburban women. "You want to make it look more intimidating?" Rodriguez asked, studying the sketches Marcus had made at 3 a.m. "I want to make it functional," Marcus corrected, "for the alpacas." But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The new fence design included staggered heights, with the main section at 7 feet and reinforced sections at critical points. It incorporated a reinforced gate mechanism that would make spontaneous vandalism significantly harder. And most importantly, it created better sight lines for the animals to perceive threats, which meant the alpacas would be more alert, more present at the boundary, more visible. It meant they'd be looking right at whoever came near. "Your neighbor is going to lose her mind," Rodriguez said, and he was smiling in a way that suggested he'd already chosen sides. "I'm done caring what my neighbor thinks," Marcus said, and it was almost true. The work took 5 days. By Saturday morning, the new fence stood proud and tall, an unmistakable statement. This boundary was not negotiable. The old fence had read as careful, considerate, something that was trying not to offend. The new fence read as permanent, final, a wall. Corinne's response came faster than expected. By Sunday afternoon, she'd filed a formal complaint with the county zoning office. By Monday, she'd created a new Facebook group, Stop the Alpaca Ranch Expansion, despite the fact that nothing had expanded. By Wednesday, she'd organized a neighborhood meeting and invited the county inspector. The inspector who arrived, a tired-looking man named Hendricks who'd probably seen every possible variation of suburban conflict, walked the property line with Marcus and pronounced everything legitimate. The fence met code. The alpacas were legal. The property was zoned correctly. There was nothing, he informed Corinne, who'd shown up at her own time to present the community's concerns, that he could do about it. Corinne had smiled at him with the particular sweetness of someone about to backstab, and informed him that the alpacas had been documented displaying territorial aggression patterns. "They're guard animals," Hendricks said, clearly having heard this already from Marcus. "That's their purpose." "Exactly, they're weapons. Armed guards on a residential property. Isn't that a liability issue?" Hendricks had looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and something in his expression shifted. It was the look of someone who just realized that this wasn't actually about code or safety. It was about one person's need to win. "They're alpacas, ma'am. They spit. That's their main line of defense. I'd be more worried about your mailbox than your personal safety." Corinne had left the inspection red-faced and muttering about lawyer fees and county incompetence. But she didn't stop. Over the next 3 weeks, Corinne evolved her strategy. She started documenting the alpaca's behavior, every time Lancelot approached the fence, every time Duchess pricked her ears, every time Boomer engaged in the normal territorial behavior of animals in their own space. She accumulated these observations into a thick file, complete with timestamps and photographs, which she mailed to the county, the local animal control, the state agricultural board, and most audaciously, the local news station. The news station, to their credit, did not pursue it. But the incident of attempting to weaponize the media against Marcus stayed with him. It was a different caliber of escalation. It suggested Karen was moving beyond complaint and into something more strategic. Marcus found himself consulting with lawyers. Defensive moves, nothing more, just understanding what his legal position would be if Karen decided to actually follow through on her increasingly aggressive threats. The lawyers he spoke to all said the same thing. She didn't have a case, but she could make his life expensive and complicated, which was sometimes enough. It was Patricia who finally told him the thing that changed everything. She showed up on a Thursday evening, after Karen had apparently called her again, to organize what she was calling an emergency neighborhood coalition to address the alpaca situation. Patricia looked tired, older than she had even a week before. "She's talking about the fence like it's a personal attack," Patricia said, sitting in Marcus's kitchen with a glass of wine he'd poured without asking. "Like you put it up specifically to hurt her. I've tried to tell her that's not. I've tried to explain that people don't generally make major property decisions based on someone they've never met. But she's convinced that the whole thing is aimed at her, that you're deliberately trying to intimidate her and the community." "Why is she so obsessed with this?" Marcus asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Because you didn't care about her complaint," Patricia said simply. "Because you didn't capitulate, because you did the opposite of what she wanted, and in her framework that's a direct refusal to acknowledge her authority in this community. She was the person everyone listened to. She ran the book club, organized the neighborhood watch, scheduled the street cleaning. And then you moved here and you didn't acknowledge her, you didn't ask permission. You didn't make yourself small enough for her to fit you into her world." The psychology was almost textbook. Marcus understood it, could see the mechanisms, but understanding didn't make it less exhausting. Because the thing about people like Karen was that they couldn't tolerate being ignored, and they couldn't be reasoned with, and they could only be stopped by one thing: outright victory. "I think," Patricia said carefully, "that she's going to try something dramatic." It happened on a Tuesday morning, which seemed to be Karen's favorite day for operations. Marcus was inside, working through his email. He'd started a small consulting business to keep himself occupied and purposeful, something his therapist had recommended, when he heard the sound again. The bolt cutters. But this time there was something else. A vehicle engine, the backing up beeping of a truck, and underneath it all, a kind of manic energy that made Marcus's stomach tighten. He ran outside to find Karen herself, which was shocking because he'd never actually seen her do anything in person. She always used mechanisms of complaint and procedure, physically cutting through the fence while her husband, Marcus, had never seen him before. The man looked deeply uncomfortable, operated a truck with a flatbed trailer. She was cutting out entire sections. Not just one gap, but methodically, deliberately, moving down the line like she was performing surgery. She wore thick work gloves and safety goggles, and her face had a flushed intensity that Marcus recognized immediately as the look of someone executing a plan they'd convinced themselves was righteous. "Karen," Marcus called out, moving toward her. "Stop, you're destroying property." She didn't look at him, just kept cutting. The bolt cutters were huge, professional grade, the kind that could go through heavy-gauge steel like butter. "This fence is a violation of the community standard," she said, her voice sharp and clear, the kind of voice someone used when they were being recorded. "I've documented it. I've reported it. You've refused to comply with reasonable requests for its removal. As a concerned citizen, I have every right to challenge unsafe structures on the boundary of my property." "It's not on your property," Marcus said, feeling anger rising in him like water. "It's on my property. You're committing destruction of property. There are laws against this." Karen finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright, almost feverish. "I'm documenting all of this," she said. "I have a lawyer. I have witnesses. I've informed the county that I'm performing necessary remediation of a dangerous structure. The only person breaking laws here is you." Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The operator on the other end was bored until he said the magic words, "Someone is actively destroying my property." Then she got very interested very quickly. Karen kept cutting. She was methodical about it, moving along the fence line, creating a series of gaps that looked less like an act of vandalism and more like a systematic dismantling. Marcus counted 6 sections down before he heard the sirens. The police arrived, 2 officers in a small-town way that suggested they'd never actually had to deal with anything serious before. and immediately looked confused about what to do. Karen had indeed called the county and spoken to someone about remediation concerns, which meant the police weren't entirely sure if this was vandalism or something more legitimate. Karen's lawyer had apparently called the police station ahead of time, which Marcus found out when one of the officers, Officer Davison, according to his name tag, mentioned it almost apologetically. "She told us you were refusing to remove an unsafe structure," Davison said to Marcus, not quite looking him in the eye. "There's technically an ordinance about property owners' obligations to address hazards that pose a threat to the community." "The fence doesn't pose a threat," Marcus said, trying to control his voice. "And I didn't refuse anything. The county inspector approved it. It's perfectly legal." Karen called out from where she was now packing up her bolt cutters. "The alpacas are the hazard. I've documented their aggressive behavior. I've filed complaints. This man refuses to take responsibility for his dangerous animals, so I'm removing the structure that's enabling their territorial aggression." It was genius, in a horrible way. She'd constructed a narrative where destroying the fence was actually a public safety measure. She'd found a legal framework, however thin, that made her vandalism look like concerned citizenship. The second officer, younger, maybe mid-20s, was already texting someone, presumably his supervisor or the county, and Marcus realized with a sinking feeling that this was going to become complicated in exactly the way he couldn't afford. "I'm calling my lawyer," Marcus said. "Of course you are," Karen replied sweetly. She was putting her gloves in a bag, moving with the satisfied movements of someone who just executed a plan successfully. "I'll be contacting you about the cost of professional removal for the fence sections you're leaving exposed. They're now your liability." She got in the truck with her husband, who looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else, and drove away. The damage report came later that day. Karen had managed to cut through 8 sections of fence before the police arrived, creating approximately 40 feet of exposed perimeter. She'd also documented everything, photographs, timestamps, even video, and had indeed somehow convinced herself that she was in the legal right. Marcus's lawyer, a sharp woman named Susan Chen, no relation, who specialized in property law, was blunt. "She's going to argue that this was legal remediation. She's going to argue that you've knowingly harbored dangerous animals in a residential zone. She's going to tie this up in court for months or years. The good news, she doesn't actually have a case. The bad news, she has the resources to make your life genuinely difficult while we prove that." "So what do I do?" Marcus asked, though he was already thinking about the alpacas, about the exposed fence, about the vulnerability that had been deliberately created. "You fix the fence," Susan said. "You document that it's been repaired and that it's secure, and you wait to see what she does next. But Marcus, understand this, you're no longer just dealing with a complaint. You're dealing with someone who's moved from harassment into direct action. That's escalation. That's someone who's decided that legal channels aren't working and she needs to take matters into her own hands." "What does that mean?" "It means she's not going to stop," Susan said flatly. "Not until something stops her." The fence was repaired within 2 days. Rodriguez was philosophical about the damage. "She's just giving us more work," he'd said, and the new sections were installed even more robustly than before. But Marcus knew something had shifted. The boundary had been violated, and Karen had proven she was willing to cross it. The alpacas knew it too. After the cutting incident, they changed. It was subtle but undeniable. They moved differently at the fence line, with more intensity, more focus. Lancelot, in particular, began a pattern of vigilance that seemed almost ritualistic. He'd position himself at the fence at specific times of day, watching the road with an intensity that went beyond normal animal behavior. Duchess stopped being flirty with the fence and started being protective of it. Boomer, the youngest and most playful, shifted into a mode of alertness that made him seem older, harder. Esmeralda, the gentle one, the one who usually just grazed peacefully, began working the fence line with the kind of focus usually reserved for predators scanning territory. They had been animals, now they were sentries. Marcus understood the shift because he felt the same one inside himself. The fence wasn't just a boundary anymore. It was a statement. It was, "You will not pass." And both Marcus and his alpacas had committed themselves fully to that statement. When Patricia came by to bring another casserole and apologize again, she'd commented on the alpaca's demeanor. "They seem different," she'd said carefully, "more intense." They are, Marcus agreed. They know something happened. They know the perimeter was breached. They're doing what they were bred to do, protecting. Against what? Patricia asked. Against Karen, Marcus said simply. Patricia had gone very pale, and Marcus realized he'd let her see the extent of his own shift. He'd moved from someone trying to maintain peace to someone who was okay with whatever came next. The weeks that followed took on the quality of a stalemate, but it was the kind of stalemate that existed before wars. Karen had publicly committed herself to the removal of the fence. She'd filed lawsuits, frivolous, according to Susan, but costly to defend against. She'd organized a formal petition, this time with 43 signatures, though Marcus noted that roughly half were from people who clearly had no idea what they were signing. She'd even contacted an animal welfare organization, trying to get them to file a complaint about the alpacas. The animal welfare people had actually visited the property, spent an hour with the alpacas, and informed Marcus that they were in excellent health and well cared for. They'd also informed him that the organization had received complaints from Karen that they'd previously classified as serial harasser complaints, meaning Karen had developed a pattern of weaponizing animal welfare concerns against multiple property owners in the community over the years. It was Marcus's lawyer who suggested he start documenting Karen's behavior more formally. If this escalates, Susan had said, and I think we both know it will, you'll want a clear record that you've been the reasonable party and she's been the aggressor. So Marcus started a log. Every incident, every contact, every threatening letter or confrontation. He installed cameras on his property, both to protect against further fence vandalism and to document the alpaca's behavior if Karen tried to claim they were dangerous. He'd been passively peaceful. Now he became actively prepared. Karen responded to his preparation by accelerating her timeline. In mid-August, roughly 6 weeks after the fence-cutting incident, she showed up at his property line with a county inspector, a different one this time, and a woman Marcus didn't recognize. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Huang from the State Veterinary Board. Karen had apparently filed a formal complaint that the alpacas were being kept in a way that violated animal welfare standards. Marcus's heart had sunk because even though he knew the complaint was baseless, he also knew that investigations, even baseless ones, were disruptive and scary. Dr. Huang, however, was thorough and fair. She spent 4 hours examining the alpacas, reviewing their medical records, which Marcus had impeccably organized, and assessing their living conditions. She watched them move, observed their behavior, checked their body condition. And when she was done, she turned to Karen with an expression that was professionally neutral but unmistakably final. "These are among the healthiest alpacas I've examined," she said flatly. "Their living conditions are excellent. Their owner clearly understands alpaca care and animal husbandry. There are no violations here, not even close." Karen's face had flushed. "But they're aggressive, They're alert," Dr. Huang interrupted. "They're aware of their surroundings. That's not aggression. That's exactly what you want in a guard animal. If you're frightened of them, the problem isn't the animals. The problem is your understanding of what these creatures are." After Dr. Huang left, Karen had stood at the fence for a long moment, and Marcus, watching from the porch, had seen something shift in her. The certainty had cracked slightly. The armor of righteous complaint had developed a fissure. But she didn't leave. Instead, she'd pulled out her phone and made a call. Marcus couldn't hear her words, but he could see her gesturing, pointing at the alpacas, gesturing at the fence. She was regrouping, recalibrating. That night, Marcus's lawyer called him. "There's been a development," Susan said. Her voice had that carefully controlled tone of someone delivering bad news. "Karen has filed for a temporary restraining order. She's claiming the alpacas pose a threat to her safety and the safety of neighborhood children. She's requesting that you remove them from the property pending a hearing." "On what basis?" Marcus asked, though he could already imagine the creative legal framework she'd constructed. "On the basis of documented aggressive behavior and failure to properly contain dangerous animals despite warnings. The judge has set a hearing for next Thursday. We can fight this, but you need to understand. Restraining orders are easier to get than to defeat, especially if there's any ambiguity about public safety." Thursday came gray and tense. The courthouse in the county seat was a modernist building that looked like it had been designed to make everyone uncomfortable. Marcus sat next to Susan in the courtroom, watching as Karen presented her evidence. a thick folder of photographs, timestamps, video clips of the alpacas at the fence. The evidence was entirely circumstantial and mostly misleading. A photo of Lancelot with his ears pricked could be presented as aggressive posturing. Footage of Duchess approaching the fence could be framed as threatening behavior. Video of Boomer running in the pasture could be edited to look like unprovoked aggression. Coren's lawyer was good, not brilliant, but competent enough to make it seem plausible that untrained animals were being allowed to terrorize the neighborhood. Then Marcus testified. Susan asked him questions about his training, his experience with alpacas, the purpose of the animals, their actual behavior patterns. And then Coren's lawyer cross-examined him. "You keep dangerous animals on residential property," he said flatly. "You've installed a 7-foot fence specifically to conceal their behavior. You've refused to work with your neighbors despite their reasonable safety concerns. Isn't it true that you're more interested in hiding these creatures than in integrating with your community?" Marcus looked at the judge, considered the question, and answered truthfully. "I installed the fence because the animals needed security and privacy. I've refused to engage with demands that contradict professional advice about animal care. And I'm not interested in being bullied into getting rid of animals I've chosen to keep on my own property." The hearing lasted 2 hours. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Morrison who looked like she'd seen every possible variation of suburban conflict, ruled at the end. "I find no evidence that these animals pose a direct or immediate threat to the complainant or the community," she said. "The complaint is based on normal animal behavior that the complainant has chosen to interpret as threatening. The restraining order is denied." But there was something in her tone when she added, "However, I would urge both parties to attempt some form of conflict resolution. A community mediator might be helpful here." The judge had no idea that conflict resolution was impossible with people like Coren. You couldn't mediate with someone who'd already decided you were the enemy and constructed their entire reality around proving it. Coren stood up when the ruling was read, and her face was something Marcus had never seen before. It was the face of someone whose certainty had been directly challenged by official authority and was trying to reprocess the world through a framework where she was still right. "This isn't over," she said to Marcus as they left the courtroom. Not in the judge's hearing, but loud enough that he heard it clearly. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied. He meant it. From his perspective, this was over. The judge had ruled. The alpacas could stay. The fence was legal. Nothing else mattered. But he'd failed to account for one critical variable. People like Coren didn't experience legal defeats as endings. They experienced them as beginnings, the beginning of whatever escalation came next. By September, the situation had developed a kind of equilibrium that was actually worse than open conflict. Coren wasn't filing lawsuits or calling inspectors. She was just present. She walked past the fence multiple times a day. She sat in her car at the end of the road, photographing the property. She'd started a new website, Alpaca Ranch Safety Watch, that documented every time someone passed the property and expressed concern about the animals. Marcus's therapist, whom he'd returned to, recognizing that he needed help to not descend into his own obsession, had called it obsessive harassment. "She can't let this go," the therapist had said. "The legal system has ruled against her, and her reality doesn't have room for being wrong, so she has to keep proving that you're the problem. It's compulsive for her." The alpacas were aware of Coren's presence in a way that seemed to deepen their protective instincts. Lancelot, in particular, had developed a pattern where he'd position himself at the fence whenever Coren's car appeared at the end of the road. He wouldn't do anything aggressive, wouldn't spit or charge, but he would watch with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Patricia mentioned, in passing, that Coren had started talking about it. "She's saying they're being trained to attack," Patricia reported with obvious distress. "She's saying you're deliberately conditioning them to see her as a threat. She's building a narrative where you're the aggressor and she's the victim. I don't know how to help anymore. She's past reason." It was the first week of October when Marcus found the gap in the fence. Not a large gap, not dramatic, but deliberate. It was at the back of the property, in a section that faced away from the road, in a place that suggested whoever had made it had been trying to avoid being seen. Marcus's first instinct was anger. His second was something worse, realization. She was going to try something more. He called Susan immediately, but before his lawyer could arrive, Marcus went out to examine the fence more closely. The cut wasn't new. It might have been there for a day or two, maybe longer, which meant it had been made deliberately at night in a way designed to be discovered only after Karen had accomplished whatever she was planning. The realization hit him with nauseating clarity. She was creating a scenario. And he understood in that moment what it would be. Karen would provoke the alpacas somehow. She'd provoke them while they were agitated by the fence breach, while their protective instincts were maximized. She'd do something that made them charge the fence, spit, or otherwise display aggressive behavior. She'd document it. And she'd take that documentation to the judge, to the county, to the media, with a narrative that was almost sophisticated in its construction. I tried to warn them. I tried to fix the problem myself. I tried to work within the system, and look what they've done to me. It was perfect, it was evil, it was perfectly evil. Marcus spent that night in a kind of anxious vigilance, sitting on his porch with binoculars, watching for any sign of Karen's approach. The alpacas, sensing his tension, had gravitated to the house. Even at night, they were alert, their eyes catching what little moonlight there was. The night passed without incident. The next morning, Marcus called a construction crew and had them repair the fence before 9 a.m. By noon, the breach was fixed, but he knew it was temporary. Karen had tasted the possibility of creating the exact scenario she needed, and she wasn't going to let it go. He made a decision that afternoon, one that his therapist would later say represented a significant shift in his coping mechanisms, but that Marcus understood as simply pragmatic. He was going to stop waiting to react and start preparing for what was coming. He upgraded the cameras on his property. He installed new ones, high definition, with backup systems and cloud storage. He made sure they covered every inch of the perimeter. He created a detailed security log. He started filing his own complaints with the police about Karen's harassment, creating an official record. He reached out to neighbors, not to organize against Karen. Patricia had warned him that was futile, but to establish relationships and have witnesses to her behavior. And he spent time with the alpacas, reinforcing their routine, keeping them calm, making sure they understood the boundaries of acceptable behavior. October moved into November, and the waiting became a form of torture. Every day without incident felt like borrowed time. Every night, Marcus would lie awake, wondering when and how Karen would make her move. Patricia brought him warning in mid-November, and her voice had shifted into something he'd never heard before: fear. "She's ordered something online," Patricia said. "I don't know exactly what, but she's been having packages delivered, and she's been talking about needing to provoke a documented response. I think she's planning something specific, something timed. You need to be ready." The next week was Halloween week. There were trick-or-treaters in the neighborhood, children in costumes walking up and down the streets. Karen would know that. Karen would count on the fact that the alpacas were more alert when there was unusual activity, that they'd be more likely to seem threatening to children, that the scenario she created would be loaded with maximum emotional impact. On the night of October 31st, Marcus stayed up. He was on his porch at midnight, exhausted and wired on coffee, when he saw her. Karen's car pulling slowly down the road, parking just past the property line. Karen getting out, carrying something Marcus couldn't quite see in the darkness. Karen approaching the fence with a kind of determined precision that made the alpacas immediately tense and alert. Marcus moved fast, hitting record on his phone as he approached, but not so fast that he'd seem like the aggressor. He needed to see what she was doing. He needed documentation. By the time he got close enough to see clearly, Karen had already produced whatever she'd brought. It was a bag of carrots. Organic carrots, he'd realize later, which Karen had specifically selected because the alpacas liked them, because they'd respond to them, because they would approach the fence eagerly to get them. She was calling to them softly, "Here, bobbies, here, sweeties." The alpacas, who by this point were thoroughly conditioned to be suspicious of Karen, approached cautiously. But they were still animals. Food was food. They moved toward her, toward the fence, toward the boundary between her space and theirs. Karen pulled out her phone and started recording. And that's when she did it. From the bag, she pulled something that looked like a syringe or some kind of stick object, Marcus couldn't quite see, and jabbed it toward Lancelot's face through the fence. The animal reacted exactly as any prey animal would when confronted with something threatening. He reared back, squealed, and made a movement toward the fence that could easily be interpreted as aggressive. "Help!" Karen screamed loud enough to echo down the block. "He's attacking! The alpaca is attacking me!" But Marcus had it all on video. He had the jab. He had Corinne's deliberate provocation. He had her scream, which had come only after she deliberately startled the animal. "Stop," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous in a way he'd never used before. "Stop right now." Corinne turned to him, and there was something in her expression that was almost triumphant. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd created the perfect narrative. "Did you get that?" she called out loudly, and Marcus realized she was performing for neighbors she'd alerted to come watch. Did everyone see what this man's animals do? Did everyone see how dangerous they are? But the neighbors, the few who'd emerged from their houses, looked confused. They'd heard screaming and alarm, but what they'd witnessed, once Marcus played back the video, was a woman provoking an animal and then calling for help. Patricia was there. Patricia had come running at the sound of the alarm. She stood at the fence, saw the video Marcus was already showing, and her face moved through a series of expressions: shock, disgust, and finally, a kind of sad resignation. "Corinne, no," Patricia said softly. "Corinne, you can't do this." "I'm documenting dangerous animal behavior," Corinne said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "No," Patricia said. "You're documented harassing and provoking animals. You're documented trying to create a scenario. There are witnesses now, real ones." Corinne's face went pale. The narrative she'd constructed, the scenario she'd orchestrated with such care, had failed. Because she'd underestimated one critical factor. She'd underestimated how obvious her own actions would be when examined in real time. She got back to her car without another word, and Marcus watched her drive away, knowing that something had fundamentally shifted. She'd made her move, and it hadn't worked. And now she was stuck with the reality that her attempt to destroy his life had been captured, documented, and witnessed. The following Monday, Marcus's lawyer filed a formal harassment complaint against Corinne Montgomery with the county sheriff's office. The evidence was overwhelming. Months of documented contact, the fence cutting, the vandalism, the court hearing, the photographed instances of trespassing, and most critically, the video of her deliberately provoking an animal while recording herself screaming. The sheriff's department took it seriously. An officer came to Marcus's house, reviewed the video, and informed him that they would be charging Corinne with animal cruelty, harassment, and trespassing. The news hit Willow Creek like a stone dropped in still water. Patricia later reported that Corinne's Facebook group had basically imploded once people started seeing the actual video evidence rather than Corinne's narration of events. The petition disappeared. The GoFundMe for the lawyer was refunded. People quietly began distancing themselves from someone they'd previously followed because she'd seemed confident and certain. But the community response, while satisfying, wasn't the point. The point was what happened next. Corinne, faced with actual legal consequences and the complete collapse of her social narrative, did what people like her often do. She escalated one final time, but differently. Instead of continuing to target Marcus or the Alpacas, she targeted herself. The story hit the local news in mid-November. Corinne Montgomery had attempted suicide, an overdose that was discovered by her husband when he came home from work. She'd left a note, which she read to a police detective, that described her as a victim of an unsafe community that had refused to listen to her warnings. Marcus found out from Patricia, who appeared at his door with the same expression she'd worn when reporting each previous development, a mixture of sorrow and exhaustion. "She's in the hospital," Patricia said flatly. "Her husband says it was serious, that she might not." Patricia couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus felt something complicated bloom in his chest, not satisfaction, because how could he be satisfied that someone had nearly killed themselves? But not guilt either, because he'd done nothing wrong. He'd simply existed and built a fence and refused to be bullied. "Is she conscious?" he asked. "In and out, according to her husband. He's been saying a lot of things. He's saying the community failed her. He's saying people were cruel. He's saying it was all a misunderstanding that got out of hand." "Is he blaming me?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "He's blaming everyone, including himself. I think he's in shock." Corinne spent 2 weeks in the psychiatric hospital. During that time, the harassment case against her was suspended, pending her recovery and mental health evaluation. The district attorney's office had essentially decided that prosecuting someone who'd attempted suicide wasn't a good look, even if that someone had engaged in clear harassment and cruelty. She was released on November 28th to her husband's care, with a recommendation for intensive therapy. And then, in the first week of December, she came to see Marcus. She showed up on foot, which was strange. No car, no performance for neighbors, just Corinne walking up the driveway to Marcus's house with her husband a few steps behind her. She looked smaller than Marcus remembered, diminished, like the attempt on her own life had extracted a physical toll that had nothing to do with the actual medical recovery. Marcus almost didn't open the door, but something in the way she was standing, not with the rigid certainty of someone on a righteous mission, but with the fragile vulnerability of someone who'd been broken by their own obsession, made him do it. "I came to apologize," Corinne said without preamble. Her voice was hoarse, like it hurt to use. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He looked past her to her husband, who had the expression of someone who'd been forced into this moment and didn't quite believe in it. "I was wrong," Corinne continued. She was still holding it together, but barely. There was a tremor in her voice that suggested she'd used up the last of her psychological resources just to get the words out. "About the fence, about the alpacas, about you, I was trying to prove something, to myself, I think, that I mattered, that my opinions mattered, that people had to listen to me." Marcus said nothing. He waited. "When you didn't listen," Corinne went on, "when you just did what you wanted and didn't ask my permission and didn't try to convince me I was wrong, I couldn't handle it. I couldn't accept that I wasn't important enough to matter to you. And so I made it my mission to prove that I was right. I made it my mission to destroy your fence and discredit your animals and basically make you pay for not acknowledging my authority." She stopped talking. She was breathing heavily, like she'd just run a mile. "I tried to hurt myself," she said, "because I couldn't hurt you anymore. And I realized in the hospital that the person I was actually hurting was me. That I'd constructed this entire reality where you were the villain and I was the victim, and I was willing to do literally anything, to prove that narrative true, even hurt myself, even try to end myself." Her husband put a hand on her shoulder, and she flinched slightly at the touch. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Corinne said. "I don't expect anything from you. I wanted to tell you that it was me. It was all me. It had nothing to do with the fence or the animals. It had to do with my own broken need to be right and to matter." Marcus looked at this woman who'd consumed months of his life, who'd tried to destroy his sanctuary, who'd cost him thousands of dollars in legal fees, who'd shown him the worst possibilities of human obsession. And he felt nothing. Or rather, he felt something like compassion, but it was distant, like looking at a creature in a nature documentary that he could observe and understand without being emotionally connected to. "Thank you for telling me," he said. It was the most honest thing he could offer. Corinne nodded, and then she turned and walked back to the car with her husband, and Marcus watched them drive away. Patricia came by the next day, and Marcus told her what had happened. Patricia looked relieved in a way that suggested she'd been carrying worry about this final interaction. "Do you think she meant it?" Patricia asked. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that she meant it in the moment. Whether that meaning lasts is something she'll have to figure out. But it's not my job to monitor that or believe in her recovery or make sure she stays sane. My job is to take care of my property and my animals and myself." Patricia nodded like she understood, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the alpacas graze in the pasture beyond the fence. By January, life had settled into a new normal. Corinne wasn't in the neighborhood anymore. She and her husband had moved to the city, seeking a fresh start. The fence had been repaired and reinforced one final time, and Marcus had decided it would stay as it was, tall, visible, unmistakable. A statement, a boundary, the point beyond which obsession could not reach. The alpacas, too, had settled. They'd remain alert, that was their nature, but they'd lost the specific tension they'd carried during Corinne's campaign. They grazed peacefully. They accepted visitors from Patricia and other neighbors who'd come to understand them as gentle, intelligent creatures rather than threats. And Marcus had come to understand something about himself. He'd wanted peace, and he'd found it, but not in the way he'd expected. The peace hadn't come from isolation or from refusing to engage with conflict. It had come from setting a boundary and defending it completely. It had come from understanding that some people couldn't be reasoned with, and that was okay. It had come from choosing himself and his sanctuary over the demands of someone whose demands were bottomless. On a cold morning in February, Marcus stood at the fence with a cup of coffee, watching Lancelot graze, and he realized he was happy. Not in the desperate, Instagram-worthy way he'd imagined before. but in the quiet, grounded way of someone who'd survived something difficult and come out the other side still standing. The fence cast a long shadow in the early morning light. Behind it, the alpacas moved through their day with absolute certainty of their place in the world.